The debated direction deduction, which is entirely unnecessary. No, my dear Watson. The more deeply sunk impression is, of course, the hind wheel, upon which the weight rests. You perceive several places where it has passed across and obliterated the more shallow mark of the front one. It was undoubtedly heading away from the school. This is Holmes's reasoning, or at least the small portion he chose to voice to his companion Watson behind a deduction of direction made in The Adventure of the Priory School. This simple statement has seen numerous arguments made both for and against its validity. This paper is intended to illustrate that no one need question the master's powers of coming to such a conclusion given the abundance of information at his disposal. Let us dissect Holmes's statement and see where the true questions lie, if any exist at all. It is reasonable to accept that the track with a deeper impression should belong to that of the hind tire. This would certainly be true if the rider is seated during travel. Now an individual could lean forward on their handles, which instinct might suggest if trying to flee from a scene or some impending harm. However, common sense would suggest that this would not last long, since the tactic would not lead to any foreseeable increase in velocity, given the tire that provides traction and thus movement is the back tire. So while it is possible that this portion of the statement is not ironclad, it seems unnecessary to dissolve the deduction based on these discrepancies. In keeping track, there is nothing that impressive in any argument against this part of Holmes's statement. The next piece of Holmes's conclusion has certainly been met with some skepticism, the rear tire's obliteration of the more shallow track on the front tire. The tracks of the tires have been a point of contention in many arguments against Sherlock Holmes' proclamation. It has been posed that only one track could have been visible, essentially assuming that the rear tire followed the path of the front tire exactly. That, or the rider was skilled enough to pop a wheelie for his entire trip, but this seems highly unlikely both in reality and in practicality. However, a single turn of the bike in either direction skids this argument to a halt. In Which Way Did the Bicycle Go? And Other Intriguing Mathematical Mysteries, Joseph D. E. Konhauser, Dan Vellman, and Stan Wagon demonstrate, using some high-powered mathematical modeling involving tangent lines to curves, that not only would turning the wheels at least temporarily create two separate paths, but the shape of the curving track could actually be used to tell the direction of the bike. So it appears that any argument made towards this portion of Holmes's statement has been obliterated, thanks to the one constant in this universe, mathematics. The third and final declaration that Holmes makes to Watson is the most questioned aspect of his conclusion. Following Watson's narrative of Sherlock's report, it suggests that Holmes is basing his deduction on the previous statements of impression depth and interaction of tracks from the two tires. A.S. Galbraith argues in The Real Moriarty, but it is clear that the tracks would look the same both ways, unless the tread had some lack of symmetry or other peculiarity, and the manner of mounting it on the wheel were known. It is at this point that Sherlock, and thus Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, receives the most criticism. In fact, after receiving such vehement questioning on this specific line, Doyle responds in his autobiography, Memories of Adventure, "I had so many remonstrances upon this point, varying from pity to anger, that I took out my bicycle and tried. I had imagined that the observations of the way in which the track of the hind wheel overlaid the track of the front one when the machine was not running dead straight would show direction. I found that my correspondents were right and I was wrong, for this would be the same whichever way the cycle was moving. On the other hand, the real solution was much simpler, for on an undulating moor the wheels make a deeper impression uphill and a more shallow one downhill. So Holmes was justified on his wisdom after all. An argument could be made that perhaps Doyle was bullied into not defending Sherlock's power of sheer knowledge, and that his familiarity with 42 different impressions left by tires might have given him the ability to recognize the direction of the tread. This is, however, assuming, as Galbraith points out, that the wheel is mounted correctly. Even so, while the author admits the flawed logic in his piece, he also provides a simple alternative that allows for faith to be restored in the master's observational analysis. However, why should the alternatives end there? Holmes's efficacy of processing all possible visual information from the surrounding area could certainly lead to a wealth of additional evidence. For instance, in analyzing the tracks of the tires at any point the bike turned, it would be the case that the indentation of the tire tracks would be deeper as the bike begins, or leans into, the turn, as opposed to coming out of the turn. It is also the case that any small object that was passed over by the tires would be pressed into the ground in the same direction as the bike's movement. A more technical observation that Holmes could have attempted to make would be in analyzing branches of bushes or trees found throughout the path of the tires. it is possible the writer would have collided with, and hence broken, several branches, and the direction of the break in the stem could give indications as to the direction traveled. But perhaps the simplest examination Holmes could have made would have been at the point where the rider fell down. There was a broad irregular smudge covering some yards of the track. Then there were a few footmarks, and the tire reappeared once more. It would seem reasonable that the direction of the footprints, or certainly the last footprint, would be in the direction the rider was facing after remounting the bicycle. Perhaps this observation was not exciting enough for Holmes to share with Watson, thus he kept it to himself. Is it true that Holmes could have provided Watson with a more thorough inventory of clues that supported his deduction? Perhaps. However, it is also possible that Holmes was simply trying to give an efficient exposition for his companion to be on board, rather than pontificate on the plethora of evidence that maintained the conclusion. T.S. Blakeney supports the common occurrence of such an event in Sherlock Holmes, Fact or Fiction. In any case, Holmes probably had a dozen other small indications to guide him, though he might mention only one factor. He usually had others in reserve as evidenced by the 23 additional points of difference in the joint letter of the Cunninghams, the Reigate Squire. Thus, the tiresome argument made against Holmes, based solely on reasoning he spoke aloud to Watson, carries little tread. The chain of events involved allows ample opportunity for Sherlock to cycle through a deluge of information in order to substantiate his claim. Similar to the seemingly endless supply of bicycle puns this author has chosen to incorporate as he bikes up Holmes. Alright, that last one might have been too much to handle.